Hello everyone! In this episode I will show you how you can distribute content for DAZ Studio. This is technically a video for one of my wonderful Patreon supporters, Pablo, aka Blue Eagle 327. Pablo said, "Hey Jay, I've made a prop. I've spent quite a lot of time getting the textures right and building the prop. Now I want to share it with people. What do I do? How do I do this? It's a very complex process." And I agree with you, Pablo. It is something that I wanted to make a video on for a while. And it is the same principle for anything that you distribute. Could be a scene that you've built in Blender or wherever. Could be an item of clothing that you've made with Marvelous Designer. The steps of packaging content are always the same. And there's a lot more to making content, of course. But I thought this is a great video that'll show you on one simple prop how you can share the whole thing with somebody so that it works on their system. I will be practicing with something that another Patreon supporter of mine has made, namely Brian. He made this wonderful Tangaroa coffee mug. If you've been following our raft journey, this is an item that we discover in the game. Tangaroa is kind of a corporation, almost. It's a place we find, mysterious place floating out in the jungle. And Brian thought it was so hilarious that he remade the Tangaroa coffee mug. So I'm going to put a link to this item into the description so you can get it from his coffee store. It contains the OBJ and 3 maps, namely the diffuse, the roughness and the metallic map. And that is exactly what we need to make that prop look amazing in DAZ Studio. So what we'll do then is we'll turn this into something that'll show up in the content library. The item is not going to be smart content compatible. That's another process. I'll talk about that at the end of the video. So it'll be available in the content library. And if you've examined that, then you will know that there's quite a lot of folders in here. So mine is primarily the My DAZ 3D library. That's the main content folder in which our prop is going to end up in. Well, not on our computer, but on our customers, friends, beta testers computer. And if you open that up, then you can see that there's various other folders in here, Ani-blocks, animals, and so forth. And we have a props folder. In the props folder, we then usually have either the item directly in its own folder, so you could say coffee mug, that would be a subfolder inside the props folder, or more commonly you have a vendor like this here, CMC, or you have Posto Pacifico, that's a product with several things, or you have the vendor stonemason, under which we then have another folder for the particular item, and inside that we then have either more items, or we have, the items in question, like, either the scene, or you have another folder structure that is materials or whatever. It depends on how complex your project is, really. But that's the folder structure that we want to follow, and it's the same no matter what you distribute. So if you were to distribute clothing for a Genesis figure, for example, you'd go into the people folder, and in there you find the generations of things. So let's say Genesis 8 female, you open that, and then you have a clothing folder, and you'd follow the same principle. So in the clothing folder, you'd have your name, like your vendor name could be like whatever. In my case, it would be Jay vs. Lewis, or it'd be the WP Guru, or in Brian's case, it would be like Zero Calvin. And in that, you have a folder that would describe your product, depending on how many products you're thinking of releasing. I mean, if you have something that's called whatever, a neon monokini, you could just put that directly into clothing. There's no real rules or regulations there. It's just something that is, it's kind of evolved over the years, and we should follow those conventions. So in our case, we're not going to be doing clothing, so it's not going to go in the Genesis folder. We're going to put it into our props folder, but we're not going to save it directly into the current content library because there's other stuff in there, and that'll make it really difficult for us to grab it out. Let's instead create another folder on our desktop. I'm just going to create an empty folder, and you can call it anything you like. You could just call it product. You could call it coffee mug. You could call it anything you like. I might just call mine product so that I know this is the product that I'm making for the coffee mug. So now inside product, I will go and create some other folders. The first one is going to be the props folder that we've already seen. So let's create another one that's called props, which follows exactly that convention that we've just seen there in the DAZ library. And inside here, I might either just have a folder called coffee mug, or I'm going to have something called J, another folder called coffee mug. I might just going to call that Tangaroa coffee mug. And in this folder is where I will save all the DAZ files that I'm going to need. I'm going to go 2 steps up and back to where it says the props folder, so basically in the root directory of my product folder here, and I'm going to create something else that's called a runtime folder. And that's something that goes even further back in the ages. That is where I'm going to save my textures. So technically you could save textures anywhere inside this folder, but convention is that back in the day, like literally we're talking 15 years ago, when DAZ Studio and Poser had compatible file formats, that Poser files could be read by DAZ Studio and vice versa. Back in those days, another convention has evolved, and that is where we store the textures, and that is in a folder called runtime. Inside it, we're going to make another one called textures. And inside it, and this is just, convention so that things end up in the same place there, you can make another folder that'll be your brand or name. Like in my case, maybe I'm going to call it WP Guru. And inside here, I'm going to have another folder that is going to be the folder for my maps. So I'll call this one Tangaroa Maps. Whoops. There, that's it. In here is where I'm going to copy my maps. Again, this is so complex because content creation has evolved over the years, and this is just a convention that's being used. So in your product folder, you have runtime, you have textures, inside it you have the vendor, inside it you have the product, and inside it you have the actual maps of the product. So in my case, that's the Tangaroa maps. Let me just go and move that over here and open the Tangaroa mug that I've downloaded and extracted and unzipped already. And we can see that we have the OBJ file together with the material file, and we have these 3 maps here, which is diffuse, metallic, and roughness. So I'm going to go and copy those into here, so that I can reference them in a moment. So that's really important to understand. You don't want to reference the maps that are somewhere on your computer on a network drive or whatever, because DAZ Studio will remember this direct path to that. And if you have something like an external network drive, say Z, Photoshop, textures, your maps, then the DAZ Studio file is going to remember that path. And by the time you give it to me, my DAZ Studio is going to say, I don't find the Z drive. Sorry, I don't find a folder called Photoshop texture, so I can't display this. And that's kind of the reason why that happens. Whereas when we put them into a folder structure like this, I will reference these maps, DAZ Studio is going to remember those, and it'll work on anyone's computer. That's the plan anyway. Let's see what we can do here. We're kind of done with our magic new folder. All we need to now do is tell DAZ Studio that it exists, and then save our product files into that once we set this up in DAZ Studio. So let's go do that. On the Content Library tab, we've got this little hamburger icon here. So click on that and pick Content Directory Manager. And that brings up another kind of a little scary dialog box. It's not that scary actually, but it will tell us where the content folders are mapped for DAZ Studio. So in my case, I'm looking after this one here, DAZ Studio formats. I'm not concerned about Poser file formats right now. And in it, I'm going to click that little top option here that says DAZ Studio formats. I'm going to add a directory to it, which is the directory that I've just made that's currently on my desktop. So desktop and product. So that's what I'm going to pick, say select folder, and now I have an extra product directory mapped here. This one here, there it is. If I'm done, when I'm done with my product later, I can just go and remove that again. But for now, I'm going to leave it here. I need to have that here so that DAZ Studio knows that thing is in town. It takes a moment for it to catch up because it'll go through every possible folder there. I'm going to close that down here and navigate to my product folder. Here it is. I happen to have 2. That's just because I've set up another product recently, so I could just unmap that. This is not the product we're talking about. It's this one here. Product, the one already has a little disclosure triangle here in which it says props, under which it says Tangaroa coffee mug, and that follows exactly the folders that I've just set up there on my desktop. There's nothing in here yet because, well, we haven't created a product yet. So let's make that happen now. Let's go and import Brian's coffee mug via import OBJ. It's already here. That's the one. Tangaroa mug OBJ. I'll open that. I'll pick the DAZ Studio defaults, and there it is. It's tiny, but that's because it's to scale, made for DAZ characters. I can go and zoom in on that, and I'll show you a little trick here. When you save this out in a moment, you will see that DAZ Studio automatically creates a thumbnail from this. You can override that. You can just make your own thumbnail. That's not a problem. I'll show you where that is as well, but just so that you know what will end up on the thumbnail, don't save your product like this. Save it in full screen what you want to show on the thumbnail, just so that you have something that looks better than, not so good. So you can set your render settings to a square aspect ratio, and then switch on the show aspect frame, and then you know exactly what's going to end up on your thumbnail. So maybe this is how I want my thumbnail to look like. But first of all, I'm going to have to set it up. So this is just the diffuse map on here. So with the Tangaroa mug, you can go and rename it as well. I'll just leave it as it is. You head over to surfaces, and on Tangaroa mug, there's one surface here that's called coffee mug. And this is the one that I want to set up now. Most of my properties are under basic, or under base rather. Under base we have diffuse, and one map is already here, but that references now the diffuse map from the one that's still in the old folder. I need to pick the one that's in my new folder, namely the one that's in the runtime textures folder. Let's go and do that. Let's browse there. This is the old folder. My other thing is also on the desktop under product, under runtime, textures, WP Guru, Tangaroa maps, and there's the diffuse. It's important that you replace the maps when you set up the product for distribution. There we go. Looks like nothing's changed, but it's because the map's the same, but it's in a different location, and that is important. So we also have a metallicity map, and that's also here under just above diffuse, metallicity or metallic map. Browse to the same location and apply that. We also, that gives us this shine here, and you need to crank that up to 1. And as soon as I hit return, you will see that there's a little difference here. Now you have that shine. So for the map to kick in, it needs to be set to 1. Next, we also had a roughness map, and that is here under glossy. It's called glossy roughness in DAZ Studio. Same principle. Browse to the map, browse to any of the other maps that you have, and apply them. Again, roughness has to be set to 1, and then we see that some parts of the mug are now rougher than others. And that is, for my object, all that I need to do. Now let's go and save our prop out to the relevant folder, namely so that it ends up in here. You do that by selecting the object you want to save out first. You could have multiple in your scene, so make sure you select the one you'd actually like to save out. So in my case, it's the Tangaroa mug, and then I'll head over here to File, Save As, and then I'll scroll all the way to the bottom here, Support Asset, and then we say Figure Prop Assets. And once you do that, it'll come up with a little file dialog here that asks you where would you like to save that. And that is, of course, in a folder on the desktop. So on my desktop, product, inside props, inside Tangaroa coffee mug. And I'll call that Tangaroa mug. There we go. Or Tangaroa coffee mug. There we go. Coffee is always good. You save that. And DAZ Studio will ask you a few impertinent questions. Namely, what is your vendor name, what is the product name, and what is the item name, and so forth. We can just fill in the options that we know about. So the important one is the asset directory that this will be saved into, and I'll show you why in a moment. You could pick another one right now here, but we need the one that's already pre-selected, so that's on the desktop, my product. My vendor name, I'm going to call it Javers Lewis, that's perfect. Product name, we'll just leave it as product, and item name is in fact Tangaroa coffee mug. Feel free to change these if you like. There's also metadata that we can create with this. I'm not going to explain that here. What we need is write the geometry definition, so write out a geometry file, and DAZ Studio will do that inside a data folder inside this folder. So that's where the geometry is being saved. So remember, the maps we've already copied manually, we're referencing them, but the geometry, the writing out the geometry, DAZ Studio is going to take care of that for us. So we do not need to copy and paste an OBJ file or whatnot. DAZ Studio is going to take care of that. Write the parameter definitions and also write the UV definitions. Leave all these ticked. Then we can either compress the file or not. It's personal preference, really. The big difference is, well, size. If you have larger files, maybe compressing them might save some space. But the more important thing is that if you do compress the files, you will not be able to read this DAZ file with the text editor. In case you're curious of what's actually inside it, have a look. But you can only do that when you don't compress the file. So I'm going to leave this option off. If you do compress the file, then no one can look inside it, essentially. So hit accept. And there we have our Tangaroa coffee mug in the content library. How exciting is that? So the thumbnail looks kind of all right already, but if you wanted to snazz it up a little bit, even make it a bit bigger and put your logo in it and all that, you can do that. It is literally on the desktop, still in the product folder. You can see that under props. In Tangaroa Coffee Mug, we now have two files. We have the actual DUF file, which is the thing that DAZ Studio's just made. That's the definition file that references the textures and that references the geometry. And it also made a thumbnail for us, which has the same name as our product, just with the PNG ending. And this is the one that you can replace. Just make sure it's called the same thing and is in fact PNG format. You can make it larger. The original file format, or the file size here, is 91 by 91 pixels. That's what DAZ Studio uses. And you can make it bigger. And if you do that, when you hover over that, the thumbnail will just, pop out and just be larger, displayed a little bit larger. So DAZ Studio can handle that. While we're on this subject of the folder for the curious of you, where is the geometry? Because that has also been saved. If you go up to the very top of the folder in question, to the product folder, you see the data folder has now been added. And that is where DAZ Studio has now described the UV sets as well as the geometry file. So this is usually the larger file here that'll contain the geometry, the DSF, that's it. And then there's UV sets, and this goes on and on, doesn't it? There's default UV sets that DAZ Studio has set up there for me. So that is where that's saved. And really that is all we need. So now we have one folder whose 3 directories we can now go and zip up and share with people. And so to do that, it's important to remember, you don't zip up this folder here. You don't zip up the product folder itself. You zip up its content. So whatever's inside it, these 3 folders here, you go and right click. If you're on Windows, you can use a zip utility, either 7-zip or something, or you can just go to send to and then say compressed zipped folder. And when you do that, either one will work. You give it a snazzy name. So in my case, I'm going to call it Tangaroa Coffee Mug. So this here is now the folder that you would go and distribute and share with people and, for them to install. So when they install it, they would just go and right click this and say extract all. Then in here, they would go and browse to their DAZ 3D library or wherever else they want to install this. So in my case, that's in public documents and there's my DAZ 3D library. If I go and select that folder now, this is going to be unzipped and slotted into the existing DAZ Studio library. And then I can just pick it up without having to futz with folders and whatnot. That's all we need to really do. And once that's done, once your customers are happy, you can go and remove that product folder again from DAZ Studio. So once you're done with the product, once you're happy, you're completely done here, you go back onto this little hamburger icon, hit Content Directory Manager, and then go back onto DAZ Studio Formats, open this up and find your product. This is it here. And then just go and remove that folder. And that's really all there's to it. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff that you can do for content creation. Like one of the most obvious things is add documentation, the thing that DAZ themselves are so notoriously super bad at. Add a bit of a README file, a PDF, a link to a website, something like that. I will show you how to make that happen elegantly in another video. I've done this in a stream recently. It's really, really easy to do. That is one thing I would recommend. I would also recommend you add a license that describes what users are allowed to do with the product. Can they resell it? Yes or no? Is this a thing that is in the public domain? Is it like a CC0 license? Is it Creative Commons license? Whatever. Add a license. If you distribute the product with a particular vendor, let's say Renderosity or someone else, then they often have an end user license agreement that they would like you to include, but they will guide you on where that needs to go in the zip file. That was it. I hope this was helpful, and I hope this lets you at least compile some things that you can share with the world, share with beta testers, share with friends, give away on your various stores, or even, you know, get rich with and cash in on your various talents there. I hope this was helpful. I will make more videos about content creation going forward. Thank you so much for all your support, all my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters. I really appreciate you being here. You're growing in numbers, and I can't thank you enough. It's awesome to have you. If you have any questions, do let me know. And other than that, have a wonderful time. I will see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.